As I said, if you hover over your screen and click chat, you can open the chat window, and we will be keeping track of questions and some comments during the presentation, and we will ask them at an appropriate time. We are asking everybody today to keep your microphone muted. It helps to cut down on extra background noise, and also to keep your webcam off, except for our presenter. We've noticed that Zoom is a little overworked in the last few days, and so we want to try to keep our connection as clear as possible. This is the IALLT webinar series. This is the International Association for Language Learning Technology. We have a webinar series that goes about once a month, and everyone's welcome to join. The recordings are normally a member benefit, but the IALLT board has generously allowed these special webinar recordings to be open to anybody. So we will be recording the session, and we're planning to post it on the fltmag.com site. We already have one that we've done earlier that you can find there and watch afterwards if you haven't watched it yet. Normally, I give people 6 months or a year's worth of notice before I ask them to do a webinar, and this time Lauren agreed to do one just within a few days, and so we really, really appreciate your generosity with your time in this really difficult moment, Lauren, for putting this together so quickly. We have Lauren Rosen, who's from the University of Wisconsin, and she's got a great topic today, which is what to expect from the unexpected. Thanks so much, Lauren, for being with us with such short notice. Lauren, unmute yourself.
I'm glad to do it. I'm hoping you're able to hear me okay now.
Yep, sound good.
Okay, great. Well, the first thing, everybody needs to take a really big, deep breath. Breathe in and breathe out. This is completely outside of anybody's territory, and that's okay. Keep in mind that you need to keep yourself healthy and comfortable with what you're doing in order to be able to help your students. And so I'm going to try and hit upon some ways to do that in the next hour, and also give you time to ask some questions. As we get started, one of the first things that I want you to do is to get a bit of perspective. I'm lucky, I have a full refrigerator, I have plenty of toilet paper, all of that is fine, but I don't know what my students have. My own children, we have it, you know, our home is fine, but we don't know where our students went home to, right? And you have to keep that in mind. Also, many of you may now be working out of your homes in situations where you've got young children running around, or maybe you're taking care of a ill family member. So there's only so much you can do. So keep that into perspective, and it's okay to lower your expectations even of yourself. We're all sort of working in an emergency environment. And so don't think that you're going to be teaching as solid of a course as you previously had when you were doing things the way that you were comfortable and the way that you were used to doing them. So kind of let go of some of that. Our students are as concerned as we are. They didn't choose to be learning in an online environment, and some of them are not equipped to do that in a number of ways. Not just technologically, but also just social emotionally, and knowing how to organize their time and all of those kinds of things that come into play. So we're all in this together, and it's okay to let your students know there's going to be bumps and bruises along the way, and they're learning and you're learning at the same time to the best of your abilities. So kind of keep that in mind as we go through this. As I mentioned, kind of lower your expectations. You're not going to be able to create in a week's time what online teachers spend months and months and many trainings to do. Your audience is also different, as I mentioned previously. Your students weren't planning to learn in this environment. Start with what you already know how to do and what you already know how to use. That'll help you feel comfortable. That'll help your students feel comfortable. You don't want to be learning 100 new technologies. And I have been getting all of the emails that I'm sure you have too about this technology and that technology that's now free to the end of the semester, etc. And that's all great, but put that in your back pocket for right now, because we're just getting started. And you know, if 2 or 3 weeks from now you want to start exploring some of those things after you've gotten some semblance of control over the environment that you're working in, add in 1 or 2 slowly, but don't try and jump on all kinds of new technologies right now. It's not the time for it, and you'll just become overwhelmed and frustrated. So kind of slow down on that. And you also similarly shouldn't be going down the rabbit hole of searching on the web, because there's so much out there. So organizations like IALLT putting out these webinars. I know ACFL is coming out with some things this week. You may have state associations that have been posting, or there may be some Facebook groups that you've joined. And I've got some resources at the end of my slides here too. So I would recommend that you kind of stick close to the language organizations and language learning area. If you do random Google searches, you're just going to get a million hits that are going to become overwhelming, and you're going to lose all kinds of time that you don't really have right now. So just sort of a reality check there, I guess you could say. Okay. For my first tip, communication. Communication is really the key. It's always been the key, and it's something that language teachers fortunately have do a lot of thinking about. So some of you may have already done some types of communications online with your students where they're doing some kind of recordings or things like that. So you're kind of ahead of the curve from a lot of other disciplines. It's really important to message your students early and message them often with updates. Don't think that your students, if you just put a due date in your Canvas site, that will be enough. Send out an announcement reminder, because they're not necessarily used to looking there for that information. So as many different ways as you can reach out to them to tell them what's going on, what to expect, what's coming, the better. Also, have those lines of communication open, going both ways. So if you haven't done it before, if you don't already have some kind of way of communicating with your students, maybe in a discussion board in your learning management system if you have one, or maybe you're using, I don't know, Flipgrid or a Facebook group, make sure you've got some way for them to communicate back to you. And let them communicate about the things that they're concerned about, even if it happens to be in English. Maybe they're having a really tough time trying to get a handle on this, and they just need to tell you that. So give them a space to do that. Also, as they're sort of adjusting to this new environment, they're going to be hitting bumps along the way. I think that it's important to know ahead of time as best we can what they do and don't have access to before we start planning our lessons. So whether you send this through an email communication to sort of survey your students, or you create a Google survey, or however you want to do it, just 3 or 4 questions to find out what kind of access can they expect to have. If their parents are now working at home and the internet in general is taking a lot of weight right now, they're not going to necessarily be able to do a bunch of synchronous conferences. You need to sort of rethink and retool what do you really need to have happen face-to-face. There's been a lot of what I would call mixed messaging out there as far as whether or not students should be expected to do synchronous communications or not, whether or not we should put due dates on things or not. So we need to sort of take a step back from all that, and we can't necessarily make 100% what those decisions are going to be or what that's going to look like until we know more from our students also. And keep in mind what you're capable of doing. If you've got little kids running around, or you're trying to take care of a sick family member, you need to take care of yourself, and your own needs before you're really going to be able to help your students. So do what you can as you can. We all have busy schedules, and time management is really difficult for some students. You know, some of them, college, if you are a college instructor, your students came to college and it was a refuge for them away from whatever is happening at home. People who are in the K-12 system also coming to school that day can be a refuge. Now they're at home. You don't know if they're getting regular meals. You don't know if they're in an abusive situation or if they've got, you know, all of the tools they need. So their ability to manage their time is going to be compromised by all of the other things happening in their environment. There have been so many postings about what to do and what not to do. I'm going to just give you my take, and you can take it or leave it. I'm wearing both the educator who deals with online technology hat, and I have a freshman in college, and I have a junior in high school. And what I can tell you, my freshman in college is completely freaking out right now. She took one online class about a year ago, and she failed it. And now all of a sudden, all of her classes are online, and she does not know how to manage her time well enough, and she's afraid she's going to fail everything. So my take on all of this is put due dates, but be flexible. So you put a due date in, and even if that due date, I would have your students doing something every day where they have to show you that they've been there. So maybe it's even just a reflective question of, tell me what questions you still have, or whatever it is. And as soon as a student doesn't turn something in, that's when you reach out to them directly and you say, hey, I noticed you didn't turn this in. I just wanted to check in and see if everything was okay. Just because you have a due date doesn't mean that you have to start taking off points when it doesn't come in time, even if that was how you had your original syllabus. It's time to maybe change that syllabus and be a little bit more flexible. They need our support as much as we need them to learn. So keeping all of those sort of pieces in mind. As far as synchronous meetings go, again, look at your lesson plans. Figure out what really has to happen synchronously. So for example, if you tend to do think, pair, share kinds of things, rethink how those might work. And I'll get to a little bit more of that later. But any of those kinds of things that you want them to do where they have to be on synchronously, you're going to have to make sure that you have regular announcements about it, and also be flexible about whether or not they actually attend that, because they may not be able to. So you may have to come up with multiple ways for students to show you what they know that are outside of that planned synchronous time. When you do synchronous time, check with your students, but it might be easiest for them to do it during what would have normally been your class time, or it might not. It might be that they're busy during the day trying to deal with family things and evenings are better for them. It's hard to say. So that's where that surveying of your students might come in handy, knowing a little bit more about what their flexibility is, what their time commitments are, and what their situation is right now in terms of where they're living, because they're just as busy as you are trying to figure all of this out. Do what you know. I'm going to show you a couple of samples of some lessons. Some of the instructors that I work with were kind enough to let me show their Canvas page, just to give you an idea of what a lesson can look like when it's asynchronous and online. So this first one, hopefully you can see it. So this is a very stripped down Arabic lesson, okay? These are, the learning objectives are there first. You can see that there are going to be due dates as they go along. There's some scaffolding going on here, using the textbook and materials that students already have, where they're not needing to do a lot online. They're asked to record and submit a dialogue. Our students, the majority of them have cell phones. That can even be done with a cell phone. So I know some of you may be concerned that that's the only thing that they can work from. Again, that could be a question on a survey to find out, do they have access to a laptop? Do they have access to a computer? If not, and they're working from their phones, that's going to limit their ability to do some of the things that you might like to have them do. And that's where some of the apps can also come in handy, because a lot of them do work well on phones. But don't jump into a whole bunch of new apps if you haven't been doing that. Keep it simple, kind of like this at the beginning. There's written submissions, and you can have students, if you're not in a course management system where you have a text box that students can type in, maybe they handwrite it on a piece of paper and they take a picture of it and they send it to you. So whatever ways you need to do that, it's okay. And you don't need to prescribe the tool. You don't need to prescribe technology, but you might want to give them some suggestions for technologies that they can use. I'm going to show you another sample. This one's a little bit more complex. This is a Japanese course. This is rather than being a whole week's lesson, this is a single day's lesson. And so she's got her outcomes up there. She's got a tip of the day, some practice using Quizlet, using YouTube videos, some charts and things to help students learn. And then if I go down here, read the textbook grammar explanation and or watch the following video. So giving your students multiple means of learning. Ultimately, we don't really care how they learn it, we care that they learned it. So the most important part here is this concept check. The concept check is and it doesn't have to be long, it can be 3 or 4 questions. Just find out whether they understood what you had hoped they learned. So that's really going to be the key to giving you feedback and sort of impacting your instruction, determining what maybe needs some more guidance. So those concept checks are going to be really important. And I would include a reflective question in English at the end of it. So that'll help you to know where your students are at, what kinds of questions they still have, where confusion still exists, that sort of thing. And in this particular case, this instructor teaches 50% online and 50% face-to-face. So she has her PowerPoint slides for the next day that they can look at. If you happen to be a PowerPoint user, you may have never done this before, but you can record your voice. You can do a voiceover in PowerPoint. That's a possibility for a way that you can share some of the content that maybe you've already created, but you're not able to do in a face-to-face class. If you are not experienced in the flipped lesson approach, I really recommend chopping up any content that you're creating to smaller chunks. Our students can't digest hours of information at one time. So if you split it up into 5 or 8 minute chunks and then give them concept checks, you'll be able to get information back from your students regularly on the finite pieces that confuse them, so you can be able to address those. Down here, she's using Flipgrid, which allows her to have sort of a video-based discussion board with her students. I'm gonna show you just enough to not show you any names. Oh, they're all in Japanese. So, but this gives you an idea of what Flipgrid might look like. Flipgrid is free to all educators. When you get to a point that you're ready to add some new technologies that you haven't done before, that's one you might want to look at, for example. Let me go back to my slides here. I know that a lot of people, especially with languages, are worried about, how am I going to get enough audio from my students? How am I going to find out how well they're doing with their speaking? So start with those recordings that maybe they can just do on their phone or inside their learning management system. There are some other resources, like I said, that are at the end for some really good technologies for students to practice both asynchronous or all asynchronously, but practice speaking. So what you saw in Flipgrid, that could be considered presentational because your students practice ahead of time and prepare it before they record it. Extempore is a really great tool for something that's more spontaneous. So those things are things that you can have a chance to look at down the road. But first, surround yourself with the technologies that you're most familiar with. That's where you're going to be most successful, and that's where your students are going to be most successful, doing what they already know. So we talked a bit about the synchronous versus asynchronous parts of teaching. Be careful to not just do listening tasks. You don't want to get caught up in just one mode of communication, which may tend to happen when you first get started, where you're doing a lot of students listen or watch or see something and then they tell you what they understood. That's great interpretive practice. Definitely keep doing it, but also look back at your lesson and see, did I have any form of interpersonal communication happening? Did I have some presentational communication happening? So you're going to need to integrate all of those pieces and not get caught up in one. You may have to go back and really look at your lessons to see where those spaces are, and then consider, how are you going to do that? Are you going to have students recording and uploading content just from their phones? Are you going to be using some of those, the tools within your course management systems? Are you going to be reaching outside? And IALLT is a great organization for helping people with integrating technologies. Pick one, do it really well first, add another, do that one really well first. We're all here to help you as best we can. Assessments. So you might have to rethink your assessments as well. There are some technologies out there for Ring. Some campuses have already had licenses to use them, some have not. One thing I really want to caution you about them is that they can feel creepy, especially now that your students are working at home. What the proctoring software does is it basically turns on a camera that shows you that your students are just working on the content you've asked them to work on. And it asks them to scan the room before they get started to show that there's nobody else in the room and that they don't have cheat sheets or whatever on their desks. I would suggest rethink your assessments and assume that they're going to be open book. Assume that your students are going to have access to online materials, and ask them the kind of questions that they can't just answer by looking them up in Wikipedia. Ask them the kind of questions that connect information that they're learning to themselves, so that they're really showing you what they can do and what they know. So get beyond the kinds of things that would lead them to simply plagiarize information. I would be very careful about those proctoring technologies. I'm not saying don't use them, especially if you've already been using them, then your students are at least familiar with them, but I'd be careful about adopting them right now, unless you're under some kind of mandate where you have to, and start rethinking the kinds of questions you're asking and the information that you're hoping to get back from your students. Okay, be flexible. I mentioned being flexible earlier. Remember, you're not alone in this. You're not gonna build that perfect online course in a week's time, and that's okay. And you need to be okay with that. Be honest with your students and letting them know you're all gonna hit bumps and bruises along the way. They will too, and you're learning this together. When things don't go as they planned, work on a new plan. One of the things that the instructors I work with who are all teaching in some format of blended and online learning say is that having done that, they've become much more flexible in general about their teaching approaches and the kinds of ways that they present content to their students. So be open to letting your students tell you, boy, I really just couldn't access that. Is there some other way that you can provide that information to me? Or is it okay if I turn it in this way because I couldn't do it that way? So be flexible, and be, you know, lenient maybe if you have to with those deadlines and so forth, especially as we first get started into what this is going to look like. You can still hold high expectations for your students, but lower your expectations for yourself and what you think that you can manage to do in such a short time. So I had said at the beginning that I wanted to make sure that there was plenty of time for questions. And I know that the chat has been going crazy and I haven't been able to watch it. And that some of you also sent in some questions, which unfortunately I haven't had a chance to read through. So feel free to ask them now if I didn't touch upon them earlier.
I have kept track of some of the questions that's come in so far. Some of the stuff you've touched on already, but you might want to say a little more about it. So one here is, could you talk about asynchronous tools that allow students to continue developing speaking, but won't overload them in terms of technology?
Yeah, so I especially like Flipgrid as a basically video-based discussion board, and it's free. I also really like Extempore. If you haven't become familiar with Extempore, it is the first tool I have ever seen that does asynchronous, spontaneous communication. The way it works is you set up the kinds of prompts that you want. And they can be, you know, audio, video, text, however you want them to be. And you determine how long the students have to look at a prompt and how long they have to respond to a prompt. And when the student goes in, they are told you're going to have so many minutes to look at or so many seconds or whatever you want it to be to review the prompt, and X amount of time to respond to the prompt. Are you ready? And then when they're ready to go, that's all they get. So they don't have the time to go out, research it, and come back to it. They don't get a chance to review the prompt ahead of time. So that's really kind of nice. They also have a feature called Rooms, which is the closest thing I've seen to a face-to-face asynchronous discussion, because it does a similar thing in that the students can review the comments from whoever else is in their group only one time, and then they respond to it. And then when their response is responded to, they can only see the next response. So it's done asynchronously, but you can't just go back and review everything like you would in something that's been recorded and allows you to play it over and over again. So I think those are really good for students to be practicing some of the speaking skills. There are plenty of other tools out there. I know even we use Canvas in our learning management system. Students can actually record their voice or record a video of themselves just right into a discussion board. So you can keep it simple like that as well.
Someone asks, what is the best way to record a two-way conversation remotely? I assume the person meant students.
So it kind of depends on what your students have access to. If they're using a computer, they could, you know, hopefully you have access to some sort of, if you want them doing this, some sort of a synchronous tool like Zoom. And students, if they're familiar with something like Zoom, they can go in there and actually set it to record, and they can share it with you. That would be sort of the low end way, if you will, of doing that, because it's all kind of built together. That makes it the easiest. There are screen capture tools such as Screencastify, whereas if your students are doing a FaceTime conversation, they could capture that with the Screencastify screen if FaceTime is what they're used to using and they have access to it. So I think we also may need to let go of the importance for right now of having to have that synchronous time, because your students may not be in a place where they can have synchronous time. So we're going to have to make some exceptions, I think, to that. So be a little bit careful in your survey to your students to find out what they have access to. Find out how reasonable it is for them to have synchronous time. And if you're going to do it, I wouldn't do it 5 days a week for 50 minutes at a time, because there's no way anybody's going to be able to keep up with that. So sort of lower the need or the expectation that they're going to be doing so much synchronously, and really look at your lessons to make those synchronous parts as targeted as possible.
Okay, a next question is, do you have a suggestion for how to deal with Google Translate during assessments?
Okay, so we all know that we, for the most part, can tell when students are using Google Translate because they end up with things that either don't sound right, or it's using a level of maybe a grammar structure that they haven't learned yet. So one of the first things you might want to do is a lesson on plagiarism. If you're concerned about that, there are a number of resources out there, and I'd be happy to share some with whatever ways IALLT will let me, that I use to sort of get students to recognize that Google Translate doesn't do everything. So that would be the first step with that. I think that the way that we ask questions and the way that we ask students to produce content needs to change a little bit so that it will help prevent some of that. We can tell when our students are reading. If they're reading an answer that you didn't want them to be reading, don't grade it as if it was a spontaneous, creative chunk of content. Grade it as if it were something that was read and they're practicing pronunciation. So we need to sort of rethink what our students are actually going to do, and rethink our grading accordingly, so that we're grading them on what they're actually doing and not what we had wanted them to be doing, if that makes sense.
Do you have suggestions for doing vocabulary quizzes?
I mean, vocabulary I would teach with, in a context, so it wouldn't just be a vocabulary quiz. Unless you're talking about, I guess if you're doing sort of a formative assessment, you can do things like that with even Google Forms. So going back to what you're used to using, if you're a Google school, use Google Forms. That's probably going to be the easiest. If you're a learning management system user, use the quizzing feature in your learning management system. All of those will allow you to post pictures, for example, and students can type or choose from a list kind of responses. Hopefully that answered the question.
Someone asked if you have a sample survey for asking students about their technology needs, and someone else shared one in the chat, so that is great, and I've seen some circulating around, but maybe Lauren, you could just say a little more about what you ask in what you're going to use or what you have used in the past.
So we haven't used them in the past, mostly because the people who have been signing up for our courses are knowing that they're going into a blended or online environment, so there's already an expectation there. But I have seen some of the ones that are circling around. So I would say keep it short. Find out what do they have access to. So they have access to a computer. Do they have access to a cell phone? What kind of access, if any, do they have? Is it, are they working from a modem? Are they working from high-speed internet? So just kind of getting a feel for, and that could even be just asking, what kind of environment do you have in which to work on your course? Because they may be in different sorts of situations. There are people living on farms that might not even really have internet access. And then I know that like Charter Cable has come in and said that I think for 60 days, for those who qualify, they're providing free internet so that education can continue. So I think these first couple of weeks, especially, we need to really sort of assess that. And so find out what they have access to, how often are they going to be able to access? Are there any concerns that they have right off the bat? Are they, you know, if they're concerned about not having access, then we as instructors need to be prepared maybe to do things via email if we have to, so that it, and give them more time on things. So a lot of it is really just getting to know where your students are with this. And I think the sample that was shared would be a good sample. I can share some more samples after the webinar also, if IALLT wants to have a space where there's a list of things like that, and then pick and choose.
I think that the previous webinar we posted on the FLT mag, and we were also able to post the PowerPoint that went along. So I think if we do that again, we can probably add some other resources onto the same page. So fltmag.com is where we're planning to post these things afterwards. Oh, and I was going to say, this is going back to correspondence course days, right? And I heard that it was either Ben or Jerry of Ben and Jerry's who learned about ice cream via a correspondence course. So it can be something that you can use to learn. Somebody asks, in Canvas or Blackboard, can anything you upload be downloaded or streamed so that they can listen in their own time? And does this also go for recorded synchronous sessions in case someone had tech issues?
I believe that some of those settings, and it depends on the learning management system, I believe some of those settings come into play when the instructor sets it up, and or when the way the administrators of the learning management system have set it up as to whether or not files are allowed to be downloaded. So I would check with whoever is the administrator on your learning management system to find out.
Okay, and someone asks, what is the simplest way to tie multiple technologies together? And the person mentioned an RSS feed, wondering if that's a good option.
I haven't used RSS feeds to tie content together. I tend to use a page, and within that page, I would organize my content, which might have multiple types of technology in it, kind of like the Japanese one that I showed you. There were YouTube videos embedded. There were links out to some other resources that were available. There were some online Quizlets and things like that that it linked to. So I think, you know, for our students' understanding, to put it all into one space in a page so that they know what all of those pieces are, and perhaps in the order in which you would want them to use it. Sorry, my phone is ringing and I'm going to just hang it up if I can find it. I can't find it. Never mind, it's too far away. Sorry about that.
Someone asks, can a class play Kahoot on Zoom? And some other people answered that we think yes. Have you ever tried that, Lauren, or something similar?
I haven't tried it over Zoom, but yes, those technologies work. And actually, a lot of them you can set up the timing so that it could even be done asynchronously. So you would post it. Rather than controlling each slide, it can be controlled by the students. I use that a lot with Socrative, Mentimeter. I'm not a huge Kahoot fan. And the reason I'm not a huge Kahoot fan is because of the timers in it. For students with learning disabilities, it can be overwhelming to see all of these other students who are able to respond faster than they're even able to read the prompt. So I can't speak specifically to Kahoot, but I know those other ones, Socrative, Mentimeter, And there's a bazillion of them out there where you can actually do them asynchronously. Yes, Poll Everywhere was one I started with years ago. Thanks for sharing that, Stephen.
Yeah, and I've used one called Pear Deck that I like a lot. I will type it in the chat in just a moment. Someone asks, what do you recommend as a backup to Zoom if Zoom fails? We are noticing some problems. I had a very problematic class earlier today where we basically had to abandon the class in the middle because Zoom just was kicking everybody out left and right. We're hoping that Zoom will be able to mostly handle this, but obviously it's a huge uptick in traffic for them, and it's amazing what they're able to handle at this point. But do you have any thoughts for how to handle what happens if your class in Zoom fails or Zoom isn't working well?
So first step is I wouldn't plan to hold all of your classes in Zoom. Really take a look at your lesson plan and shrink down the amount of time that you need to have that synchronous time together. Because we are all overloading the system. So if we can decrease that load just enough so that we can all have our 15 or 20 minutes that we need on a semi-regular basis, that's going to help with that. Really look at what it is you're asking students to do and what you're actually doing during those times, and figure out what could actually be provided asynchronously so that you're not as dependent on the synchronous time. You know, there's a lot of different synchronous tools out there. There's WebEx, there's Zoom, there's Collaborate Ultra, but they're all going to be experiencing and having the same problem until things ramp up these first couple weeks, especially when everybody's trying to figure it all out. So for starters, I would really sort of back off the synchronous time and really look at what you can do asynchronously and rethink that piece.
Yeah, and Laura suggests, and I may do this if I see that I'm going to have continued problems with Zoom. Laura said that some people are considering doing synchronous sessions, but with smaller groups, not as big of classes. I may consider that. But I also wanted to ask you, this is my own personal question, Lauren. I'm putting mine in here. A lot of people are arguing against doing synchronous time, but one of the things that concerns me if I don't do synchronous time with students, and I do understand the concerns that they have about access and everything, but I'm worried about people falling through the cracks, because I think when students feel alone out there and when they don't feel a connection with you and their classmates, they're more likely to, like I say, fall through the cracks. What do you think about that?
So yes, and that's where, as I was talking about at the beginning, how important the communication is, that it's back and forth and that it's two-way. Even if it's not a synchronous meeting that you're having with all of your students, have open office hours at certain times so that they can come and meet you. I think the idea of smaller meetings is good as well, but also we have to also be conscious of what are we capable of doing, because we have lives too. So we can't be 24/7 teaching and ignore all of the things in our background as well. So, you know, be careful about that, because you have to keep yourself healthy and well. There are many, many ways to build community online that's asynchronous. One of the first places to start, if you happen to use any sort of a learning management system where you're connected with your students, and there's a profile area, if you haven't filled out the profile and put your face up there so that you're a real human being with actual interests, do that. That could be one of the first assignments that people do, making that visual connection, even if it's not synchronous, so that you're real people. Doing some form of a discussion board, whether it's a video discussion board in something like Flipgrid, or a discussion board in your learning management system where you're communicating back and forth, and have a discussion board that can just be random communication that's not necessarily specific to the course topics at the time, so that they have a place to go and connect with you and with the other students in the class. So think about ways that you can build community without that physical presence. There's some great material on cognitive, social, and I'm forgetting the third presence: cognitive presence, social presence, and teacher presence. Thank you, Magara. So anyway, and I can post that also, which really talks about what it means to connect to students in those 3 different ways, and coming up with ways to do that aren't synchronous are possible. Being on top of students always, every day, having to turn something into you that shows you that they were in your course Monday through Friday, so that you can reach out to them as soon as you see you didn't get something in. That will help keep them engaged and keep you from losing them. And that's the fear that they have as well. The students who aren't used to managing their time, they're terrified. So the communication may not need to be synchronous in order to still be engaging.
That's true, Lauren, but I did want to say that, and I think you'd agree that that kind of classroom presence is one of the most difficult things to do, and that community is one of the most difficult things to do online. So for people who are new to it, it's going to be especially challenging. I mean, I think it's something that we all find challenging, even if we have some experience teaching online. What do you think?
I agree that it is one of the more challenging pieces, but it's also one of the pieces that has been probably most researched and shared about, because that is the biggest concern of any instructor who has ever started teaching online. I find that with a lot of the students, or a lot of the teachers that I work with, what the community building that they usually outside enhances any physical meetings that they have with their students in a face-to-face environment, whether that's over video conferencing or it's in a physical classroom. So those 2 pieces, I think, need to work together, not independent of each other. And you can create instances. So for example, in Zoom or in Collaborate Ultra, you can put students into groups, and they can meet in groups as well without you present, but it still gives them some of that camaraderie. That said, we still have to keep in mind what kind of access they have, and if they can, and how often they can. So don't try and do it every single day. That's where we're going to overload them and overload ourselves. So make it a very targeted amount of time and a very targeted purpose for getting them together, at least initially, until the dust settles. And then, you know, what you're going to do in this first week or 2 is going to sort of set the stage of where you're headed, but it's not going to be the be all end all. As we start doing this for longer, I know a lot of institutions are now closed through the end of the year, and so the rest of the year is going to be online. As you get, you know, do what you can in the first couple weeks to get comfortable, and then start adding some of those pieces in so that you're not overwhelmed and your students aren't overwhelmed. The regular communication doesn't have to happen synchronously every single day at the beginning. It can be something that gets added later as well. And all of these things can be done with whatever technologies you're most comfortable with, whether it's Skype or it's Zoom or it's something in your course management system. And that's where you use your local resources, whatever tech support you have locally, to use the technologies that are available to you to work through how your students will have access to them and how you have access to them.
Okay, we have a question, and there are lots of good suggestions coming in the chat. We appreciate all those that you're contributing. Someone asks, what about your own personal opinion of Flipgrid versus Voicethread?
Okay, so Flipgrid has been free now for quite a while. Voicethread, I used to use it a lot, and I understand that they've added some new features to it, which I will admit that I'm not as familiar with, but I've heard good things about. The main reason I stepped away from Voicethread was the cost, but I think it's a great tool. It always has been a great tool, and it was really just a matter of financing it. And I haven't looked recently to see what they're offering in terms of, because I know a lot of the tech companies are now saying, we'll give it to you free for the rest of the semester kind of thing. So they may be doing that as well. I do think that they might have slightly different purposes. But again, I haven't looked at Voicethread in a while. When I last was using Voicethread, it was like it was like slides kind of, and then you could comment on each individual image or document or whatever it was that was there. Flipgrid is really like a discussion board where there's the sort of back and forth communication of a discussion board that seems a little more natural than at least what Voicethread was originally doing.
Somebody asked about how to do office hours, and others were answering perhaps a recurring meeting in Zoom. Is that what you would agree with, or would you have any other things to add to that?
Yeah, Zoom or Skype or, whatever technology you're already using for any form of video conferencing will work for that. And then just provide your students with the link. And whether you're sending that over email or in some form of an announcement, and make that link very visible and very easy to access. Don't have it buried on one page in one unit and expect students to go back to that all the time. The other thing about that, and I probably should have said this earlier, is just because you would go through a lesson in a certain manner, your students may not do it in the same way. So as you're developing your content online, giving them multiple opportunities to reach the general resources that they want, whether help source or your office hours, repeatedly posting those so that they're available pretty much anywhere students might be looking will also be very helpful to them, so that they're not lost in the learning management system or lost in the Google Classroom trying to figure out, I know I saw it, but I can't remember where it was.
Somebody asks about what do you suggest for their home setup, maybe related to microphones, lighting. We have some suggestions coming in the chat, but what do you think, Lauren?
Front lighting is better. As you can tell, I don't have a lot of that where I am. So front lighting is going to be better, not behind you. If you have it behind you, there's going to be a glare. And really, at this stage, any way that you're connecting to your students, is wear a hat, don't hide your eyes, that sort of thing, sort of just the general being conscious of what they're seeing, which you can see yourself at the same time, so and do the best that you can, but also don't be really hard on yourself if it's not perfect. We're not looking for perfect right now. This is more like triage. So we're doing the best we can, especially in these first couple of weeks until things start to settle out and we can get some semblance of new normal.
Do you have suggestions for good ways to use the Zoom breakout rooms or tips for that?
I think that there's going to be a webinar on that. I'm hoping, I know that there was some talk about it where people would actually maybe get an opportunity to experience that or get more information on it. You can kind of think of it like you would if you were doing pair or small group activities, if you're doing a full classroom discussion group. And you as an instructor are able to pop in and out of each of the groups at your own pace to check in on them if this is during a synchronous time. One of the things that I've found out, at least with Blackboard Collaborate, which is the technology that the University of Wisconsin has adopted within Canvas is that when the students are in groups of their own, they don't have the ability to record themselves. You can only record the main session. So what somebody recommended there was that if they create their own session, if this were not a synchronous meeting of everybody, but a synchronous meeting of just 2 or 3 students with a task that you gave them, that they could then record that. But when you're trying to get everybody together and then push them into breakout rooms, then they can't record. I'm not sure if that's the same with Zoom or not, because I haven't tried it.
I think that is the same with Zoom. Yeah, and I think as you try it, you'll have to figure out workarounds for some of these things. I'm kind of new to the breakout rooms. I've used them a little bit before, but like I noticed today, for example, that I don't think they can see my my shared screen anymore once they're in the breakout rooms. So I've determined that I may need to, for example, open a Google Doc so that they can see my instructions still once they're in the breakout room. The other thing that I've experimented with today was grouping the breakout room activities. Usually I would have them a little more spread out, but because breakout rooms take a little bit of time to get going, I thought maybe it would be more time efficient to sort of do them as a little chunk. I don't know if that's really true, but that's what I was experimenting with today. Let's
Things
see.
that I found out about or found out happens with the great breakout rooms, which gets actually to that, Shannon, is the fact that if all of your instructions are given, well, and typically they're given in the main room, then the first couple minutes of the students in the breakout room is, wait, what were we supposed to do?
Yeah, exactly.
So if there's a way to provide them written instructions of what they're going to do before they get to the breakout room, so they have it, like they can look at it in front of them in writing, that might help with some of that time that's lost of them trying to organize.
Yeah, and somebody was asking if we know any other platforms that have breakout rooms. My school doesn't have Zoom. We do know that Zoom does have a free version that goes, it has a limit of 40 minutes, but I think they may be suspending that limit at this time. I'm not sure if you need to actually sign up for that, but I've seen that somewhere around. So if you are interested in using Zoom, you might explore whether you're able to get past that limit. Let's see, while in a breakout room, can the students see the instruction on the whiteboard? I think not. Am I right? Everybody needs to help.
I believe you're correct that the whiteboard sticks with the main room.
Yeah.
Other similar tools are WebEx and Blackboard Ultra, or Collaborate Ultra, which is by Blackboard. And there's a whole bunch of other ones out there. So again, that's where I say, ask whoever your technology coordinators, administrators are, what they recommend, because that's where you're going to get the most support.
Yes, definitely agree with that. We just have a couple minutes left. I wanted to let people know that we are trying to organize some more webinars for the near future. We're hoping to have one on Tuesday of next week, and then maybe at least one each week for a couple or 3, we don't know exactly, weeks after that. We're just flying by the seat of our pants. So if you let us know what you're interested in learning about, we can see what we can do to organize that. But obviously everybody's a little bit overworked at this point. So I want to let Lauren have the last word. We answered most of the questions, and I know it's impossible to answer all of them right now. We hope that you'll consider maybe joining IALLT's listserv, for example, because that's a great place to ask some of these questions. There are also some Facebook groups out there that have started where people are sharing a lot of resources. So I want to give you the last word, Lauren, but also just thank you so much for putting this together in such a short period of time. We really appreciate it.
I'm glad to do it. And I guess not that these are words of wisdom by any means, but don't forget to breathe. Put on your own oxygen mask first so that you're able to help your students, and really just take it slow. Don't overwhelm yourself, and lower your expectations of yourself. Don't feel bad if you can't do it all right now. Take it slow and you'll be more successful than if you try and take everything on at once. So don't forget to breathe.
We'll try. Thank you so much, everybody. We're planning to post this on the FLT mag when hopefully we've heard that Zoom has some big processing times for now, so we're hoping it won't take too long. But fltmag.com is the place that we're planning to post the recording of this webinar. Thanks again, Lauren, and thanks for everybody for coming.